everybody, this is Perch, and by now you've heard the news already. It kicked in last week. I'm still getting into the swing of things where I can do more of the news items that I don't know too many of you care about, to be honest. But anyway, I'll do more of those certainly in the future as we get settled here. But there is a new Spider-Man comic coming up, a new number one, and despite a lot of internet speculation, no, Jonathan Hickman is not writing it. I mentioned at the time his name had been kicked around a bunch, but it would be very odd and very unusual. And if you think about how Marvel likes to use Hickman in terms of kind of standing up a franchise, particularly where there's something where movies and other things are potentially involved in the future, Spider-Man was a weird choice for Hickman. Several of you pointed out when I mentioned this the first time that obviously he did write Spider-Man during the Future Foundation run of his Fantastic Four comic, and this is when Johnny Storm was dead ish. like as they do in comics. But and he did write a good Spider-Man there. But I still would maintain that Hickman does team dynamics and things very well. It's not necessarily the right flavor of Spider-Man, but be that as it may. The new team of Spider-Man is it's all getting buried under John Romita Jr. Basically debuting on the title. Now, why is that big news? Well, kind of two reasons. One that's reasonable, one that's kind of stupid and childish. The reasonable one is John Romita Jr. did do a fairly long run, or at least many issues on Spider-Man. And it was considered one of his better titles that he was on. If you're ranking for me, the John Romita Jr. and kind of, his ace time on a book, Daredevil would be pretty high up that list. I think his Daredevil was incredible, and I always loved that version of the character, and I liked his version of the X-Men quite a bit, the older version back in I don't know, the Mutant Massacre days. I thought that he did a pretty damn good X-Men. I think when Romita Jr. came back to the X-Men many years later, I wasn't as he had started to fall into some of the traps that I think we've seen out of his DC run. But he did do a good Spider-Man, and he's probably on the third, I think, of characters there. But it's exciting to get him back on Spider-Man in the sense that it's a classic artist returning. And if you're thinking about kind of an artist that has a lot of name value, or people really resonate with the character. I mean, obviously, Steve Ditko, Todd McFarlane, neither of those is happening, obviously. But John Romita Jr., pretty strong weight on the character. I always liked Mike Zeck's Spider-Man, but that's just me. But that's the reason why Marvel is pushing John Romita Jr. More than the writer, which is unusual for them. If you think about Marvel for the last, 15 years or so, it has been writer first, artist second. The fact that they're going so in on the artist does make me think that they believe that John Romita Jr. is going to be on this title for more than just the typical Marvel 2 issues before they swap out the artist. But we will see. But I sense that they're going to give him a good solid entry run of the title. We'll know that's in jeopardy if they start announcing things like, and for the summer we're going to triple ship. It's like, whoa, hang on. Already it's Spider-Man's coming out pretty much weekly right now during the Beyond era, and I don't know how much they plan to keep that up. I think it's probably been said somewhere in the press. But the other part of this team, before I get there, the other reason why Marvel's making John Romita Jr. a big deal is because they're saying we took him back from DC. Romita Jr. went over to DC, had a run there prior to Bendis. People think Bendis drug him over, but it was actually prior to Bendis that he went over. And he never really clicked over at DC. The Silencer was a pretty damn good title that he was on, again, for a short period of time. His Superman with Bendis felt like he did not care. And if you look, and from what I've heard over and over and over again, John Romita Jr. and Bendis get along just fine. There's not a rift between the two or anything like that. But if you look at his work on Avengers with Bendis, and then you look at his Superman with Bendis, it's some of I hate to say it this way, but some of the sloppier work that we've seen out of John Romita Jr. It really it feels like he's a lot less inspired. And a lot of people speculated, well, it's because he was working with Bendis, who's going to be inspired when you know that half the panel is going to fill up with word balloons. But they get along very well, apparently. But or maybe they're just cranking him through faster. Scripts coming in later. I know that Bendis is not always the most timely with getting his scripts out. Who knows what's going on there exactly? But anyway, hopefully we're seeing a return to form, and this is why I really hope that Marvel doesn't do any kind of double shipping or weird things with that title, and just let Romita keep a monthly pace. I think he obviously can still do it, but give him time to actually make it work. So the writer on this team, Zeb Wells. So Zeb Wells is interesting in the sense of, he was just part of the Spider-Man Beyond board, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But he just had this run on Hellions that was it was fan acclaimed in the sense that people seemed to like it. It had a lot of good praise. Its numbers were decent. It was I think above the midpoint of the X-Men books. It was not expected to be. I think Hellions was always thought of as I mean, if you look at it, they had their core books. I mean, in Marvel's mind, in the X-Office's mind, you had your X-Men. Certainly not. You got Excalibur, which they believed was one of their cornerstone books. X-Force, Marauders. These were kind of the titles that they believed were central to their line. They had that next rung out. And Hellions, from Marvel's perspective, certainly feel like that, one rung out of books. But it got good praise. Again, it sold above the midpoint of the other X books. So a lot of those titles that I mentioned earlier were selling below. And it got a good fan following. And I think the reason why is pretty straightforward. It told relatively kind of straightforward stories. It leaned into the premise, i.e. that Sinister was a bad guy. A lot of these characters are kind of broken in their own weird ways. It relied on not nostalgia. I've seen some reviews saying that, but that's not true. It relied on kind of past characters. It relied on history. Best way to put it. It actually encouraged you if you've read previous X-Men books, and you could get something more out of the title if you had, because it was leaning into those storylines. So that's a good thing. That's what comics should be. And Zeb Wells, I mean, I don't know. He didn't have any kind of adversarial relationship with anyone. He's a relatively straightforward writer in the sense of, he knows what he needs to do and he does it, and it worked. Wells is an interesting guy. If you've ever run into him in real life, he's a nice enough guy, and I don't know. He has a job to do. He does it. So him being on Spider-Man is I think a pretty big promotion in the sense that Spider-Man is one of Marvel's top titles. It sells very, traditionally in the top, 10% of what they put out. The Nick Spencer run went well. It kind of, it's hard to say rehab the character. I know there's a number of people who dislike Dan Slott and everything he did on Spider-Man, but Dan Slott's Spider-Man did sell very well. The numbers were high. Spencer's came in, and some parts of it sold higher, and then it did dip below kind of the average of what Slott was doing, and then it picked back up again. So, I mean, it was, when all is said and done, I think if you average it out, the Slott run and the Spencer run were relatively the same, as long as you took out the kind of the mega relaunches that Slott got to do with Superior, and then the title that came after that, or whatever relaunch, whatever that theme was, I don't remember anymore. Those books all skewed the numbers pretty heavily towards Slott's direction, but in general, you take those out of the equation, they're about the same. So, but as a big title, Zeb Wells is not, he's not one of the names that Marvel has pushed around a lot as one of their flagship writers. He's, I won't say relatively unknown, because he's not unknown, but he doesn't have this same kind of Marvel PR, track record that a Jason Aaron or Donny Cates or Dan Slott seem to have. Even Kelly Thompson, I think, has gotten a lot more hype out of Marvel. But it is interesting how we got here. So it's hard not to look at this and not think it was an extremely similar situation to what happened with the X-Men, in the sense that the title was moving along. Nick Spencer seemed to leave the title earlier than anticipated, partially because of the Substack deal. He had other interests. He was ready to move on. And so they bring in this team of writers. And with X-Men, you had 3 or 4 writers that came in. They were going to do a kind of an X-Men council. And this is before the current X office, but this was all of us are going to kind of write the title, and we're going to kind of collaborate and all this. And with X-Men, of course, you had, I think Ed Brisson was there. You had Kelly Thompson in there. You had Matt Rosenberg, and I'm forgetting somebody. There was a 4th name in there for a while. I could swear. In this one, you had a similar thing. You had Zeb Wells himself, who's now getting the title. You had Kelly Thompson again. You had a handful of people who were in this Spider-Man office. And the problem is, I think, to Marvel's defense, with X-Men, they really pushed it as this is the status quo going forward. This is what it's going to be. This is how, this is the new way we're going to do comics in this team-like approach. And they knew that it was a 6 to 9 month patch. That's all they were doing. I think right about 9 months. With this Spider-Man Beyond office, to their credit, they did the same kind of PR stunt for here's how we're going to do the comics, here's how we're going to have a writer's office and everything else. But they didn't give you the impression that this was going to be permanent, like they did with the X-Men. With the X-Men, I think there was definitely a trick to some extent that was being played there. But with Spider-Man, it always felt like it was temporary. You had Ben Reilly in there. It's like, we got to reset the deck a little bit, and so that's what they've done. The last piece on all this, I guess I'll comment on, is so far 14 variant covers have been announced. Now, there's no way Marvel's going to stick with just 14. There's going to be at least there's got to be another 10 or so. We don't know if some of the retailer exclusive variants are coming in. I'm sure there's going to be more with this title. I think Marvel is absolutely looking at this as potentially one of their bigger books that they get to put out. So there's going to be more variants, no doubt about it. But for now, 14 variants, which is still ridiculously too many. If we're going to predict what this title is going to do, I think north of 200,000 is probably likely. Some of you may be falling out of your chairs. There's no way. But if you look at what Spider-Man has done in the past, you look at kind of how the relaunches have functioned, especially when there's this volume of variants, 200,000 seems pretty likely. I think there's going to be some incentive programs in here to try and juice that number up a little bit. I think Marvel does not particularly love the fact that Spawn got the high numbers it did. At least I've heard that from a few people in the office. So I'm sure there's going to be an attempt to do more of it. Anyway, so we have a new Spider-Man book. It's relaunching with a new #1, just in time for it to crank out a handful of issues and then do a special. And now we're reverting to the legacy numbering. This is number 900 or 1,000, whatever we're up to for Spider-Man. I'm sure if they can, math in the limited series and several other things, we can get it to 2,000 if we start counting all the different books. I mean, come on, Marvel. Why are you just counting Amazing? You can do more than this. But are you buying it? Is the question. So I asked this question, and Nick Spencer took over, and there were a lot of people who were like, "Yes, we're in." Excited. Dan Slott's gone. I'm anxious to give this a chance. Zeb Wells, fan favorite writer. John Romita Jr. did have a good run on Spider-Man. Hopefully we'll see him do something cool here. The storyline promises that Spider-Man is going to be on the outs with the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. He's going to do something that's going to cause them to shun him. Because I'm anxious to see what this is. Because, okay, if we're going to have Spider-Man make a mistake and something blows up, and I don't know, he makes a mistake, and so he's on the outs for these groups, which to me feels like a way to kind of cheaply tie it into the movie, into what just happened with Spider-Man, that they want to kind of make him an outsider again. All right, but you're talking the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. Okay, I'm sorry, the team that has, Carol, who's at various times been drunk and caused property damage and also been possessed by an alien monster suit. We've got Captain America, who took over the country with his Nazi-like doppelganger. We have Iron Man, who has done 1,000,001 things that are a problem. We've got Blade on that team. Switching over to the Fantastic Four, Mr. Fantastic has... at various times had the council reads and other things. Okay, so wait a minute. So Spider-Man's going to make a mistake, and that's too far for these guys. What are we talking about here? Anyway, we'll read the story and see how it goes. But let me know if you're picking this up and what you think. And thanks for listening.